Then it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Hello, front page is out and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to the Substack Week in Review Unscripted podcast number 8. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and you want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. You could probably tell I have a new sound system for doing these podcasts, so we will, excuse me while I'm working through the bugs on this one. So if the tests were showing that the mic was not particularly set or was not sensitive enough, so I turned it up, and think it's okay, but it's a work in progress, so excuse me if there's any issues on this. So this week's articles that we'll review today was India weighs in on the South China Sea dispute, Plan A and regime change failed, now it's Macron and Plan B, and the final is the risk of a Taiwan invasion. So we will jump right in with the Unscripted and talk about India weighs in on the South China Sea dispute. So the question from this is India going to weigh in the South China disputes against China? And needless to say, India does have a complex relationship with China. Goes back quite a ways, including a couple of border wars and some ill will. Now, handed the border wars were quite some time ago, but they do have bad blood in there. So we'll look at first is about the complex relationship with China. There's places that India and China actually work together. They are the two most populous nations in the world. They are both part of BRICS, and actually they are founding members of BRICS, which is so the BRICS nations are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Those were the original BRICS members. They are actually more now, but those were the original ones. BRICS was created in 2009, made up of developing countries, which includes Russia, which is actually kind of funny because Russia for a time was a member of the G20, which was not considered developing countries. But anyway, BRICS is an organization founded in 2009 of developing countries. The goal of BRICS is for developing countries to challenge the order of the G7 nations and counterbalance its processes of finance and global trade. India and China both are they're both major purchasers of Russian sanctioned oil, which they receive at a good discount. Russia does this to incentivize both countries to buy their oil, and by doing that, they offer them a discount to basically keep the flow of oil and revenue flowing into Russia, despite the sanctions. India and China both decided to receive this because they wanted the benefit of their economies of having energy that is sold with that discount below market value. China has an ideological element to purchase this oil as well because it does support Russia. It does support in the UN Security Council, and it also helps them get around sanctions. And some of that's controversial, but it's pretty clear that China is finding ways to get around or get into the loopholes of Western sanctions. India is working within the sanction regime to ensure it does not risk Western sanctions on itself in response for buying Russian oil. It purposely goes through the intentional loopholes that were put in the Western oil sanction regime, so they are operating within the law. So these are things that India and China share together. They both focus on cheap energy to help their economies, and they also are members of developing nations. Despite having this, despite having the above in common, they do have a history of suspicion and acrimony, including 2 border wars in 1962, which China was considered to have lost, and 1967. In 1962, China won. 1967, India won. Probably 1962 was a bigger war than the 67 war. The other there is in economics that they do differentiate each other. Is India is presenting itself as a solution in the West, as the West has decided to decouple from China due to policies from COVID. This decoupling effort is a windfall for India, and India is presenting themselves as an alternative to China. So decoupling, what that means is the disinvestment of foreign countries from China, which is primarily due to the West realizing its vulnerability to its supply chains and being too reliant on China. COVID-19 and China's reaction, called China's zero COVID policy, of basically at that point the West had decided they were too reliant on on China for their supply chain. So they started looking at decoupling, not completely getting out of China, but reduce their exposure. And India is presenting itself as the alternative to China for Western countries. China's also foreign countries that operate inside China. China consistently interferes with them and harasses foreign countries operating within China, which includes seizing intellectual property rights, knowing what proprietary rights are, security harassment, such as censoring companies that are operating within China, even if policies are emanating outside of China, but if that company is in China, they could be subject to harassment. Also, firewall access, where China wants to be able to get access to whatever private companies are in that, or they're operating in China. So these are things that have just basically have incentivized Western countries to leave China. And again, India does present itself as the alternative. So what we go in here is that the other part is going into the economics. Is India's population now exceeds China. I think that actually happened in late 2023. Of course, it's all an estimate, but based on the expected birth rates in both countries and the expected death rate, they actually predicted that India had actually surpassed China in late 2023. Now, China has reached its peak population and is getting older, and that means this is mainly due to the one-child policy that was implemented, I think, in the 60s and 70s and went all the way through into the 2000s. That means that China has already crossed peak population and is actually starting to decline. It won't decline rapidly, but it is starting to decline. And so this means that India, because it has surpassed China, and India did not have a zero one-child policy, India can provide labor at a generally lower cost versus China. And so this also creates an issue for China, because China is currently having significant economic challenges, and that increases the chance of social unrest, which is also Western countries are being aware of that. There's probably more stability in India. The other part is India is, for the most part, what Indian law and traditions is more compatible with Western law. Obviously, at some point, for quite a long time, they were under British rule or a British protectorate, depending, I guess, on the division of when you divide when the British ruled India, but you can say that the British did rule India. They did introduce Western law concepts, and India, even after independence, has basically stuck with that rule of law, and it is much more compatible to Western companies and the view of Western law than when compared to China. India is also the biggest democracy in the world, and again, it has a more rule-based system, so companies can predict what is expected when they're operating in India when compared to China. So again, this is an advantage to Western companies and a disadvantage to China. Things aren't all that great, or it isn't all gangbusters. Remember, China has had they basically have started moving towards opening up their economy through various phases to the West since the 80s. So they have a more adaptive infrastructure than what India does. So if India wants to fully benefit from decoupling, it has to improve its infrastructure to be able to take full advantage to what the West is offering. And again, remember, this is all at the expense of China. So again, this is that rivalry between India and China. China is also damming the rivers. This doesn't get a lot of airplay. China is damming the rivers in the southern regions, in its central and southern regions of its country, and damming those rivers to rein in the energy for hydroelectric power. The result of this damming, which was not done in consultation with other companies, is taking away that river water that flows down into the south to southern Asia. It's taking that water away from China's southern neighbors, which includes Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India. Why Bangladesh is important? Because Bangladesh shares a border with India, so any type of stress on that economy or any type of collapse, for example, due to what China is doing with water. Because remember, water is a way of life in many of these countries. Bangladesh, obviously, Vietnam, the Mekong Delta. They have whole ecosystems that are reliant on water. And so if you're taking people's source of living away from them, it can cause economic pressure and cause hardships. And there's a chance that if things go badly in Bangladesh, a lot of those population will probably migrate into India and become India's problem due to decisions that China made without consultation of its neighbors to take away the river water to dam it up for hydroelectric power. So those are some things that have created issues in the economic front between where China and India butt heads. This is all going somewhere too, so we'll get to the South China Sea part. So there's also open conflicts between India and China. There's a current border dispute in the Himalayas that's been going on since 2020, where both sides are facing off with each other, and there is actually some people kind of laughed at it. Is the powers that be that were in charge of both those military forces that are facing off each other in the Himalayas did not completely trust their soldiers, so they took away their weapons. But that did not keep the two sides from fighting, and so they created makeshift medieval weapons, and they went to town over each other. I think it had to do with building some temporary military buildings on the other side that the other side didn't like, and I think actually a couple dozen soldiers on both sides were killed through these use of medieval weapons. So there is acrimony on that other side. It's not to the extent of the 62 and 67 war, but there is a face-off in the Himalayas. Both sides are building a military infrastructure that includes a road network to reinforce their positions in the Himalayas. Obviously, these are high up in the mountains. The view is that the side that can reinforce first and at greater numbers will most likely prevail in this isolated area in Asia. China most likely has the advantage in the infrastructure race. So this is something to watch out for, because if China has the advantage, they might try to act on what's going on to capitalize on their position in the Himalayas, especially if things get a little heated in the South China Sea. Myanmar. Both India and China have a common border with Myanmar. Myanmar is currently in a civil war. Myanmar is definitely closer to China than India, but they do share a common border. And both countries, both China and India, are interested in keeping the war inside Myanmar and not to spill over into their borders. So maintaining control of the borders is in both the interests of both countries. China is also using Myanmar. It's a little iffy right now because of the Civil War, but China is using Myanmar as an outlet to the Indian Ocean to establish a naval presence in the Indian Ocean, and that is basically India's backyard as far as naval forces go. So even in ongoing conflicts, there is that rivalry between the two nations. So now we get into the South China Sea with all this background that's going on between the two countries, the economic and the face-offs in these minor conflicts. The Indian Foreign Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, excuse me if I pronounced that wrong, visited Manila in March 2024. During that time period, obviously I wrote about it, there was obviously ongoing tensions between the Philippines and China over the Second Thomas Shoals and the Scarborough Shoals and the use of water cannons. And so during this time period, March 2024, the foreign minister of India visited Manila. He stated ahead of his visit that India wanted a rules-based order in the South China Sea. This aligns with the Philippine and Western views of the freedom of the sea. In fact, that's one of the points that NATO has talked about in its alignments when we're operating in Asia, is it talks about the need for a rules-based order. And the idea is that there's so much commerce that flows through the South China Sea, something like 30% of all international trade flows through there. Actually, it might be more than that. So this rules-based order that came from the Indian foreign minister indicates that India is aligning with Western and Filipino values of freedom of the sea. There's a deep interest and the foreign minister talked about it, India has a deep interest in free and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Remember, decoupling. China wants to be able to flow its products through India, through the South China Sea, up to Japan, or down south to Australia, or out to the U.S. So it's going to want to operate into the same areas that China claims as sovereign territory. So India is rejecting China's view, as most of the world does, about ownership of the South China Sea. The timing of the announcement is curious because, again, all these activities were going on between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. The announcement was curious in that is India trying to tip the balance against China in the South China Sea, basically joining the coalition that is starting to gather against China, which is a concern for China because, again, China talks about no foreign elements should be introduced in any type of activities in the South China Sea. So this is something that would be very much to the dissatisfaction of the Chinese government. Also, the Indian Coast Guard visited Manila at the exact same time the foreign minister visited. So probably not, that was probably intentional, a show of support to the Philippines. India agreed to sell the Philippines the BrahMos cruise missile, which is funny, is, again, India is part of BRICS, which includes Russia, and here India is going to sell supersonic cruise missiles that were made jointly with Russia to the Philippines to counter China. Yeah, so the web that has been weaved. Also, India has agreed to provide military support to Vietnam, and I've talked about this too as well. Vietnam is also has its own issues with China in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Tonkin. So again, India is picking sides in the disputes. Again, they are that foreign element that China is always warning countries that are around the South China Sea not to introduce foreign elements. And India is stepping right into that, knowing this will get the ire of China. So the Indian Navy has two primary goals. And obviously, if you're talking about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, it's either got to be the Indian Navy or the Coast Guard, Indian Coast Guard, that's going to have to do these activities, or the idea of promoting a free access to the South China Sea. So there's two goals of the Indian Navy. One is to promote free access to the South China Sea. That is one of the goals of the Indian Navy, because again, they have to be able to flow goods. If they are going to help the West decouple from China, they have to be able to have free access to the South China Sea. They also want to remain the preeminent naval power in the Indian Ocean. That, again, as I said, that's their backyard. So this is where, if you want to be a naval presence in the South China Sea, that helps one goal of that economic freedom to help decouple, to make India a viable option for decoupling from the economy, or for the West to decouple from the Chinese economy. They have to be able to promote free access to the South China Sea. So if they want to help establish that in the South China Sea, they could risk remaining the preeminent naval power in the Indian Ocean. Are they strong enough to be both? So to promote access to the South China Sea may require a naval presence in the South China Sea, which could impact the goal to maintain the preeminent naval power in the Indian Ocean. Just as I said before, in Myanmar, China is trying to establish a naval base in the Indian Ocean along with one that they have in Pakistan. So India has to be well aware of that. So it could also be that the both of them are trying to irritate each other by operating in each other's backyards. So India's challenge is, by nature, India is cautious not to get involved in foreign entanglements. They've obviously had wars against China, because it said 62, 67. They've been involved in several contests and almost came to, there's nuclear threat, and they were blowing up. Pakistan and India were blowing up bombs underground to show off each other. So India is not afraid to be involved in military standoffs when it serves their purpose, but for the most part, they avoid foreign entanglements. So aligning with the West and the South China Sea is something that India has to manage within its tradition of avoiding foreign entanglements. How far does India want to get itself involved in the South China Sea, knowing that the U.S. and its coalitions with Japan, the Philippines, Australia, even when you look at some of the alignments, the AUKUS Accords bringing Japan into AUKUS, there's obviously, the U.S. is in a lot of activities to try to bring all these different powers to counter China in the South China Sea, basically weigh the scales against China. So does India want to get involved in that? Do they want to be a neutral player? How does India manage that within its tradition of non-entanglement? Will it jump, again, feet first in the West? Kind of doubtful. Will they become a call it a partner third party? Not sure how that works, how China can manage that and stay out of the tangle of alignments in the South China Sea, again, that are gathering against China. Also, China is a more powerful country militarily and economically than India. India needs time to build up economically to challenge China, so it does need alliances to offset until such a time that it can become a near power with or peer power with China. So maybe some form of entanglement with these foreign powers that are gathering in South China Sea might actually help India until it becomes to a point that it can become a stronger adversary to China. Decoupling needs to continue. It has to weaken China and strengthen India to make this economic goal possible. And economics goals will allow it to spend more on military and become a more formidable power compared to China. So India needs to continue to attract the West for decoupling, so it cannot upset the West. So obviously, is it doing the activities in the South China Sea to curry favor for the West? Is it doing activities in the South China Sea to keep an open freedom of seas to allow it to trade freely in the region? Is it a combination of both? So it really, so the other thing is, so that goes into is China, by contrast, cannot act rationally that could force India into the Western camp. So China cannot do anything to try to push India too far into the camp, because into the Western camp. So China's challenged by this as well. So it's like, how will they react? Will they get more aggressive on the border in the Himalayas if India becomes more involved in the South China Sea? So will there be some type of would there be some form of retaliation for any activity that India takes in the South China Sea? Will that retaliation form in Myanmar, or will it form in the Himalayas? Also, from the point of view too, is this is a threat to Europe, is will China take all this excess capacity, because they have a lot of economic headwinds, so they have demand has fallen, so they have a lot of extra capacity in their industrial base. Will they take this industrial capacity, create more, and then just dump a bunch of cheap products into the world market, which would actually hurt India in its attempts to help the West decouple from China, because then India even could not produce these products to compete with the dumping that's going on with China. So lots of things going on in that, but it does appear that the India has decided to side with the West in the South China Sea. It's to India's benefit, both economically and militarily, to do this. But how far will they go with their history of not getting entangled into foreign wars? So that's some of my thoughts about the how India is going to weigh in. It'll be interesting to see how that comes in a few months. So the next one is Plan A and regime change failed. Now it's Macron and Plan B. This is just an ongoing discussion about Macron has been very busy. And so the question is the war in Ukraine about to enter a new phase? So I say that because President Macron has been in the headlines a lot since 2024 in trying to European security, tying European security to the war in Ukraine, basically saying if Ukraine loses, Europe is at risk. Its existence is at risk if Russia wins. Sounds like hyperbole, but there's probably some truth to what he is saying. So it's funny as an off is Macron has been incredibly unpopular at home. And is he doing this because he's truly interested in solving the European problem, or is he trying to escape his domestic headaches? Of course, it's been kind of laughing as Europe has got a lot of disagreements over farming, and that includes France, where they're French farmers are dumping cow manure or shooting it into, not shooting it with guns, but basically dumping it at government offices. So Macron has come up with this, been more boisterous over this the past few months. Is he doing it because things are not going well domestically for France and Macron? Or is he doing this because he has genuine concerns? So when we talk about the Ukraine war, there's plenty of missteps on this. That first off, Russia did not have to invade. Their security was not in imminent danger. There was no reason for them to invade. There was the mistake of isolating Russian diplomats in the years leading up to the war. So it would be, some of it was through election interference claims or accusations, and assassination attempts of dissidents, mainly in Great Britain, I believe. NATO expansion. NATO was expanding all the way to the Ukraine border. Was that necessarily the smartest move? Was there a reason that NATO felt they had to push into the sphere of influence of Russia that has basically been in existence since the end of World War II? There was a reason that NATO needed to expand. You can say yes, no, but these are things that have led to sort of leading to the war. So was NATO expansion really part of it? Yes, I think it probably did play a role. Was it the major role? No, but it did play a role. Russia and the U.S. interfering inside Ukraine domestic politics, just like the East Germany during the Cold War. It was the border between the East and the West, and Ukraine had kind of become that same, had basically become the equivalent of the East Germany in the 21st century, as both Russia, U.S. were interfering in the domestic affairs of Ukraine. So when the war started, most of us remember that the West sent needed supplies to the Ukraine in the form of man-portable anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. Obviously, we all remember the shows of Western missiles destroying Russian tanks and shooting down Russian helicopters. The Ukrainians did more with less military aid than the Afghani government did with all the American aid that was left behind in Afghanistan. The Afghani government collapsed about as fast as the U.S. left, even with all that military aid. A lot less military aid was given to the Ukrainians, and they did a lot more with it against a much more powerful enemy. So in that euphoria, with all that aid, the onslaught was stopped, and the West became more optimistic, became more euphoric, and provided ever-increasing amounts of capable weapons to the Ukrainians. And this all culminated in the successful spring offensive of 2022. And so again, the euphoria was there as the war had started moving to the Ukrainians' favor, and even as the success of the spring 2022, ever more amounts of more Western-capable weapons. We start talking about Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, M1 Abrams, all going to be sent to Ukraine. F-16 fighter jets, all just increasing amounts of aid as the success was increased by the Ukrainians. The more and more aid was poured into Ukraine from the West. The West also, when the war started, implemented sanctions on the Russian economy, targeting its exports and limiting the use of international banking. Of course, the biggest export for the Russians is gas and oil. So they were definitely targeting that. Though I did talk last week briefly, or not briefly, for some time, about how the sanctions had full loopholes and that the West probably was not really intent on trying to completely cut the Russian economy off, because they didn't want to take the pressure of increased gas prices at home, and that would probably cause some of the domestic issues in the West, where you would see support evaporate for Ukraine when people are paying over $100 for a barrel of oil. So as the war progressed, you started seeing that there was the war aims for the countries. They developed. It wasn't they just came up and sat in a room in Kiev and wrote out what the plans were, but they started kind of forming what direction they were going to go. The initial plan for the West was to keep Ukraine in the war and to implement sanctions to pressure the Russian economy to make the war too expensive and too costly to prosecute. Then going forward, so we pour in all those weapons, and they started sanctioning, and this Ukraine was kept into the war. But going forward, the plan was the Ukrainians started talking about recapturing territory that was lost both in 2022 and 2014, which is part in the Donbass and in Crimea for 2014, and larger parts of the Donbass Donetsk region in 2022 and north of the Crimea. So the West's goal was they wanted regime change in Russia. We hear us in the West had heard about the evil Vladimir Putin and that he needed to go, and that became the clear war aim. They wanted to change the regime, the leadership in Russia. That became a Western war aim. Even to the point that President Biden called Putin a murderer. That is typically not something you talk about to foreign leaders. So it was very brazen talk by the West towards getting rid of Vladimir Putin. And this also became infectious in the Ukrainian side, where they basically refused to talk to the Russians. I think they actually have a law where it's illegal for the government of Ukraine to negotiate with the Russians. That's not keeping peace talks from happening, but it's always been this fallback excuse that we hear from the sides, is that no, Ukraine isn't even allowed to talk to the Russians. The going forward war aims had a setback when the Ukrainians failed in their spring and summer offensives of 2023, despite all that equipment that we gave them. And Putin stayed in power and actually won election in March 2024. I think he was actually inaugurated this week. There's big questions that the EU would even recognize him as president. Regime change failed, and the Ukrainians failed to take back territory in 2023, even to the point that military intelligence leaders inside Ukraine itself were saying that the war was stalemated. I think actually one of the generals was fired for saying that. The West had no contingency if regime change did not happen. It also makes me wonder, if regime change did happen, would somebody in Russia all of a sudden just be better than Putin? Would they all of a sudden come embrace Western values if Putin was gone? I don't know if that was really should ever have been a worthwhile aim, because what were you going to do when, here we got, to take for example Venezuela. Chavez passes away, and Maduro is worse than Chavez. So, just because you change leaderships doesn't mean things get better. Ukraine, on the other hand, had no contingency if it could not win the war outright. So, winning the war outright was unlikely because of the demographic realities of Ukraine. Russia's GDP is over 10 times bigger than Ukraine's. This can be partially offset by Western aid, but this is a little bit deceptive. It gives flexibility to Russia having a much bigger GDP, but this is a little bit deceptive because Russia is a very big country, and so there's a lot of cost maintaining that country. So Ukraine's doesn't have to have a GDP as big as Russia's. Russia is huge when you look at the map. Ukraine is not a small country, but is nothing like the scale of Russia. So that's a big part. High GDP does give the economy a lot of flexibility that the Ukrainians don't have. But Ukraine doesn't need to match the Russian GDP one for one. Also, again, as I stated, there's Western aid that's being given to the economy that's outside of military aid. It's just to keep the economy, the government functioning in Ukraine. I know I won't get into some of the discussions about how that's being spent, if there's waste, corruption, but part of the aid to the Western country is to help keep the country going and socially stable, allowing farmers to farm, allowing government workers to continue to work and not worry about not getting paid, being able to pay pensions out to people. This all sounds pretty ridiculous to a lot of us in the West, but take out the ideological part of it. It's understandable what the goal is for keeping a society functioning, and it's hard to do in a country like Ukraine when they're under the attack. That is just a statement overall. It's not an embracing of what is going on with Ukraine. I think I've made my position pretty clear, where I think Ukraine's the aggrieved party, but I'm also believe, as I said earlier, is there was missteps leading to the war that should never have happened, and I want peace talks to happen. So that's my position on the war. So I'm talking about this as from a more of a neutral point of view, but I know that there's, we'll just say, emotions run high when we talk about these two parties, because when I wrote this paper, I got hate from both Russians and Ukrainians. So, okay, that makes you feel pretty good. If both sides hate you, you must be doing something right. So the other part is, and this is something that's much more, to me, a much graver situation than you see in the GDP issue, is the population. The population of Russia is 3.5 times greater than Ukraine. Western weapons can make up some of that. They can make Ukrainian soldiers more lethal than their Russian counterparts, but they cannot make up for the full disparity. Remember, these Ukrainian soldiers, they're partially trained by NATO. There's some leave the country and get trained, and then they come back into the country. But they're not able to fully be trained up to the level of what you see the U.S. Army or the U.S. Marine Corps, the U.S. Air Force. They're not trained to those types of levels. They don't have the luxury to do that. So they can become more lethal, but they cannot make up for that full disparity of being outnumbered 3.5 to 1. Mobilization is a touchy subject in Ukraine, because Ukraine understandably wants to preserve its younger generation to ensure the existence of the nation. Russia and Ukraine currently have birth rates that are below replacement rate. So they're having less than 2 children per woman in the country. That means that you are not going, if you're below 2, that means you are going to eventually go into some form of decline. Your population will shrink. This also means that the average Ukraine soldier is over 40 years old. What's that famous song from the 1980s where the average Vietnam veteran was 19 years old? You're talking that their Ukrainian soldier is double that age. There was some, I think there's some legislation that had been passed. Don't know if it's law, but the Ukrainians are finally looking at allowing some 23 through 27-year-olds to be drafted into the army. Again, the idea with this is that the Ukrainians' position is they want to be able to preserve Ukraine and not have the younger generation wiped out due to this war. An interesting point of view. Certainly don't see that much, especially when you're looking at soldiers that are, the average soldier is 40 years old. On the other side of it, the West has put much of its reputation in this flawed war strategy. Again, the flawed war strategy was a demographically challenged Ukraine to take back territory from Russia, and the West relying on regime change. And both these war aims failed. So what is the West going to do? Now, one thing that comes up is the West cannot lose because it's bet so much of its reputation and prestige in winning the war. So what are they to do? It's because the war was made personal by basing it around Putin and not around security. So at this point, the West is in this position that if they allow Ukraine to lose and Putin's still in power, it goes back to Macron's hyperbole that Europe is in danger. Is Europe in danger physically, or is Europe's status, including the U.S., status in the world has ever been impacted? And nations like Russia and BRICS all of a sudden could have more say-so in the world. So the West has bet a lot of its reputation on winning the war in Ukraine, and they have failed to do so. So here comes Macron and Plan B. That's what I call it, not what Macron calls it. He's just making a lot of arguments lately since February this year. Macron's argument for Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about a larger vision that he has for the EU. He wants the EU to be capable to protect Europe without the United States. He wants the EU to accept the idea of hard power. And that's the idea is that they've always said is that the European Union would exceed in soft power. That's economic and political and diplomatic power, but it lacked the hard power. It didn't have a military. It's got a bunch of nations that have smaller militaries, and then together they're actually bigger than the U.S. military, but they don't act as a cohesive force. Not saying that I accept that that's a good idea either way, but it does. The idea has merit. And I've wrote about that before as well, but we won't get into that either right now. Macron also says the idea of the EU potentially becoming a nuclear power by the use of having French nuclear weapons available to serve the European interest. That's something. We talked about that last week. He also wants economic and regulatory reform in the EU to make it more competitive with the US and China. And it's not spoken outright, but he basically wants France to be the primary influential power in the EU. He views himself, France has always been a powerful member of NATO. Not the most powerful nation in NATO, but it is always been a primary player. Sometimes it could be a pain when de Gaulle took them partially out of NATO. So France has always been a primary player in NATO, and I think it wants to become a bigger player in how Europe is formed under a French vision. So this vision applies. Now, again, this was part of a bigger strategy, big, broad, sweeping goals that President Macron has for the EU in the interest of France, and that's my own personal take on it. How this applies to the Ukraine war is in the following ways. If Ukraine is defeated, it will be a blow to Western deterrence, promises, and prestige, just what I discussed earlier, where the West cannot lose this war. So, endanger the idea of collective alliances such as the EU and NATO. If they are not able to save or prevent the defeat of Ukraine, how does that view the experiments of the EU and NATO? It will definitely weaken both, and so that's something that they're considering, especially when, again, Macron wants to strengthen the EU under French influence. Europe would be in danger of the Russian intimidation and possibly invasion, probably more so on the intimidation ground. Also, if NATO and the EU is splintered, they will be weaker to be able to resist the intimidation, not necessarily invasion from Russia, because maybe just the threat of invasion would be enough to intimidate smaller European powers, especially if the EU and NATO are weaker. Ukraine needs manpower to overcome the Russians. And this is absolutely true. Somebody's finally talked about this from the national level. He talks about the demographic impossibility of Ukraine. They don't have the manpower to win this war. European involvement, or at least the consideration of European involvement in the war, could prevent the defeat of Ukraine and save Europe. Also, the idea is that European countries should not condition any of their aid to Ukraine, such as manpower or weapons, in any form, any way. So, for example, I don't remember the name of the missiles. The UK provided missiles to Ukraine on the promise that the Ukrainians would not fire those missiles into Russian territory. Some of the U.S. is more long-distance HIMARS systems that could actually reach into Russian territory were prohibited from going to Ukraine as well. And as far as manpower goes, is when European countries give aid to Ukraine, they make these statements of saying, well, we have no interest in fighting Ukraine. Our fight is not with Ukraine. We just want to provide Ukraine with the weapons to defend themselves. Macron is saying that all those conditions should never be mentioned, that the ambiguity of it should be applied is that maybe manpower needs to come, maybe it doesn't. But don't go in there and just take it off the table and then allow the Russians to do whatever they intend to do. The issue is that Macron cannot implement these changes until the Ukraine war is over, meaning these higher level changes to make the EU into this new vision that he has. He can't do this while the Ukraine war is going on. And what he views as and again, the Ukraine war is a threat to Europe from Russia. So this war needs to end to be able to go into that next way to mold the EU. And as I said earlier, the crisis of the war is an unpopular at home creates an opportunity for him to speak on such matters. So he doesn't want to talk at home about increasing the work week hours in France when he can go and talk about something that's where he can find a little bit more open audience. Not saying all his ideas are well received, but they're certainly being better received, and you don't see anybody shooting cow manure at Macron when he's making these speeches in Europe. So the other thing that goes in there, France last week, actually I think it is on May 5th. So that was last week. France sent 100 Foreign Legion troops to Donetsk with an expected 1,400 more to arrive to assist the Ukraine army in both reconnaissance and artillery. It is assumed that these are not taking combat roles and are just there to assist, and probably somewhat of a tripwire in that Donetsk region for the Russians not to attack, or maybe dare them not to attack because maybe Russia doesn't want to widen the war. Also, what Macron said, outside of the 1,500 that he's sending, which he did announce that in April that he was going to send them, and they finally did arrive, is he said that he would deploy more troops to Ukraine under two conditions. If the Russians broke through the lines, and that's actually kind of an important issue right now because Ukraine is on the strategic defensive now. So they're not expected to do a spring offensive of 2022 or 2023. They are expected to just dig in and take the Russian brunt of things. So there is a chance that the Russians are expected to do both a spring and summer offensive of their own. They have over 500,000 combat troops, or not, I don't want to say combat troops. They have 500,000 troops available to serve in Ukraine, and they are creating a reserve inside Russia to be able to feed into Ukraine. So Russia is getting ready for an offensive. So the point of Macron is if the Russians break through, And if Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, makes a request, which is not a foregone conclusion that he will do so, but if the Russians break through and Zelensky requests help from the French would send more soldiers. Now, how quickly they can get there, not sure. It took a month to send 1,500, and that wasn't an emergency to get them there. But how fast could the French get soldiers there? Not sure. But this is an escalatory step. So the questions that come up with this decision by Macron of deploying troops to French troops into the Ukraine war, what would happen? This is my question. What would happen if the French, not operating under the auspices of NATO, because those troops, those French Foreign Legion troops, are not operating under the auspices of NATO. This is just France, who is a NATO country, sent their troops to Ukraine, but NATO, they're not part of a NATO mission. So this is outside of NATO. Article 5 does not apply for those operations inside Ukraine. So what would happen if the French, not operating under the auspices of NATO, attacked Russia from the Ukraine, and France attacks Russia from Ukraine, the Russian homeland, and Russia responded with an attack on France, the French homeland. Remember, Macron states that there should be no limits on European matters concerning Russia and the war in Ukraine. So, if that happens, would Article 5 be invoked? Because again, this why that's important is that Macron talked about there should be no limits on what European powers do to Russia. Basically, don't say you're not going to attack. Don't say you can't use these weapons. So maybe they take that to heart, and France decides to attack Russia. Russia attacks France in return. Not France in Ukraine, but France in the country of France. Would Article 5 of the NATO treaty be invoked? If so, would all NATO countries join the war due to the attack, or would they state that the decision to send troops and attack Russia was not legal through the UN or NATO since it was not voted upon? Remember, all actions of NATO of any significance have to have unanimous consent from all members. So if France sends troops to Ukraine, they attack Russian territory, Russia attacks in response, would Article 5 of the NATO treaty be invoked? Open question. Nobody knows, and France is going forward with this decision to send troops outside of consultations. Now, is this going to happen? Is Russia going to attack France? Probably not. Certainly not in this stage of the war. They would most likely attack French positions inside Ukraine. But you could see this if France from Ukraine attacks the homeland of Russia, why wouldn't Russia think that it has to limit itself to attacking 4 deployed French troops when it could do an attack on the homeland of France? So, France is not, and that's where the decision, where this has not been thought through. They've already put troops there. Don't know what those troops are going to do. Don't know exactly what their role is, except they're going to help in reconnaissance and artillery. Are they going to be just shooting the guns? Or are they going to be teaching Ukrainians how to be better at it, make training inside the country quicker? Not sure. But such a move, if NATO attacks, or if Russia attacks France, would this splinter NATO? Because many countries inside NATO who never agreed to this French deployment, and this French deployment was the direct cause of the attack on France, they would say, well, I never voted for this. If I was a country in NATO, let's say I'll just pick a country, Luxembourg. If you're a country of Luxembourg and you're saying, no, I'm not attacking Russia because I was never given the opportunity to vote for this deployment. So you will see countries that will not honor Article 5. So it's one of those scenarios. Is this actually going to happen? I don't know. So it's an open question. They don't know the answers to. But now there's French troops inside Ukraine. Ukrainians need troops. They cannot overcome the demographic challenges of being outnumbered 3.5 to 1. So the best choice for Macron and his option B, his plan B, and his vision for the EU is to find a way out of this war to keep NATO intact, and that through either a peace treaty or armistice, and then he can go through and go with his larger vision, if he can get it passed, of what the EU should be. So the other question too, final question I had, is the use of French troops in Ukraine meant to scare Russia or put a certain level of caution from them widening the war? Basically come to the peace table, because now you're going to be fighting not just an outmanned and outgunned Ukraine, you could be fighting Western troops. When you look at the EU population, it's much bigger than Russia's. Now, Russia has a lot more nuclear weapons, but we're not at that point where we're talking about, there's threats of nuclear war, but nobody's actually getting to the point that they're seem likely that they're going to be starting to shoot nuclear weapons at each other, which is probably why Macron has probably just dared the Russians to say, when Macron said, when Russia threatened nuclear war, and he was like, well, we have nuclear weapons too, and we're ready to use them. I don't think the Russians are at that point yet where they're talking about nuclear war. They'll threaten it, but that's just one of the threats they have. And it's worked in the past, maybe give hands to Macron for at least kind of calling the Russians bluff on that. All right, so the final paper this week was the risk of a Taiwan invasion. Is invading Taiwan the best or first option for China? China has been very upfront, very unambiguous that its goal is to reunite with Taiwan. I think I talked about this last week, is Taiwan was never the Chinese Communist Party's rule. They don't reunite with Taiwan because they were never part of Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party did not exist in Taiwan when it was Formosa. Formosa was part of the Japanese Empire, I think all the way into the 1890s, 1895. There's no reuniting with Taiwan. This is the taking of Taiwan. There's no reunification involved in this. So I always just get, I think it's just a strange use of words, like somehow China says, like everything with China, is somehow they see something and they claim it as their own. Kind of feels the same way. China, in its goal with the reunite with Taiwan, is violating the sovereignty with more and more frequency. Overflights, pushing boundaries of civilian aviation without consultation, doing exercises, blocking airspace around Taiwan. This has put the Taiwanese in a constant state of alert. And if you stay on alert too long, it's fatiguing, and it could be the way to mask a real invasion that's coming. So what you do is you basically keep flooding the zone with these false operations, and eventually you become used to them, and you just assume, you become lackadaisical, and just assume it's just another day of Chinese violations, and before you know it, here comes the bombers. So that's where that fatiguing, just constantly just pressing the boundaries of Taiwan military. The elimination of, this is where I could only think of, the only time I could think of arguing the Chinese point of view, is the elimination of the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist Chinese that were defeated by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. They retreated to Formosa because it wasn't theirs either, but they retreated to Formosa in 1949. And maybe the idea of eliminating the last remnants of the Kuomintang Chiang Kai-shek, hate to tell the Chinese, has been dead a long time, is this long-term goal of the CCP to take back take Taiwan. So again, it's more symbolization because that's where the nationalist Chinese, their arch enemies, ran or retreated to avoid complete destruction at the hands of the Chinese communists. So there's political and economic benefits to China if it takes Taiwan. And so is Xi Jinping, the president of China, trying to make this, air quotes, reunification of Taiwan his lasting legacy. I like to call it his vanity tour in Chinese history. He will succeed if he takes Taiwan, not reunite, takes Taiwan. He has succeeded where Mao Zedong failed in his goal. Mao Zedong is the original leader of the Chinese Communist Party, longtime guerrilla leader before he became the crap show of a leader of the Chinese Party, and there's lots of fun history in that one. So the taking to Xi Jinping taking the air quotes reunification is a political goal for Xi Jinping. Now the economic goal for China for taking Taiwan is that China will have access to 92% of the advanced computer chips production and 18% of the semiconductor production. That's how much of Taiwan's makes. 92% of the advanced computer chips, not all computer chips, the advanced computer chips production is made in Taiwan, and 18% of the semiconductor production. So China will either seize the control of those assets, or or they will have taken the production out and not available to a technology-hungry world. What I mean by that is Taiwan destroys that capability before allowing it to fall into Chinese hands if they decide to invade. The military benefits if China captures Taiwan. It will break China into the first island chain, which extends from the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia all the way to the Malay Peninsula. The island of Taiwan / Formosa is part of the first island chain. So basically, China is outside the first island chain. Taking Taiwan would break China into the first island chain. So China is hemmed in, which limits its access to the Western Pacific and the South China Sea just by by Taiwan being there, that presence there. It is a big island, so it is a way to keep China from fully accessing the Western Pacific and the South China Sea. If Taiwan is taken, the PLAAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, it's a mouthful, would be able to forward deploy into Taiwan, and it would be able to extend its air cover. This air cover would cover nearly all of and enforce its illegal claims into the South China Sea. Right now, the Chinese Coast Guard is the one that has to carry most of the air quotes enforcement and illegal harassment of the Philippines in Vietnam, but Philippines being the biggest party that the Chinese harass on a regular basis. The Chinese Air Force could also play a bigger role in the enforcement of the South China Sea, the illegal claims of the Chinese in the sea. The People's Liberation Army Air Force would be able to provide air cover to, here's another name, the People's Liberation Army Navy. It would be able to provide air cover to it. That is not currently available to the Chinese Navy. I'll just call it the Chinese Navy, because they do not have a fully used. They do have 2 aircraft carriers. Sea trials happened last week for the first. That might be years before it becomes available. They have 2 Soviet-era style aircraft carriers. One they bought from the Soviet Union, or actually Ukraine, after the fall of the Soviet Union. The other one is a Chinese-made aircraft carrier along the same lines as the Admiral Kuznetsov. So it's not an effective aircraft carrier fleet. Definitely nothing that can challenge the U.S. Navy, and most likely the Japanese have launched something of an aircraft carrier for the first time since World War II by converting one of its destroyers into a ship that can support not only helicopters like it could before, but F-35 fighters. So the People's Liberation Army Navy does not have a way to have air cover over its fleet, so it would be unable to operate fully into Pacific unless they broke into the first island chain where the People's Liberation Army Air Force could actually provide the air cover and allow it to operate more effectively or extend its operations deeper into the South China Sea. The PLAAF, operating out of Taiwan, would be able to cover the northern and western approaches of the Pacific, and these are both potential vectors for the U.S. Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. So it seems like the political, economic, and military benefits of seizing Taiwan are there for the Chinese. So it seems like an easy decision to improve Chinese stature and position, though it is still a risky operation. So the U.S. did a pretty in-depth study of taking Formosa, and they were making a decision whether it was the right decision to do. So in trying to make the right decision, the U.S. did an in-depth planning of what it would take to conduct an operation to take Formosa, Taiwan, and the capture of it would be able to provide a large U.S. staging base to launch attacks against the Japanese homeland, including invasion. So they would probably move the B-29s from operating out of the Marianas into Formosa. And that was one of the intent. And then the island is big. It's got a lot of depth to it. So they would be able to basically put all the invasion forces into Formosa. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, was an enthusiastic supporter of the operation, and Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was kind of a tepid supporter. I don't know how much of a supporter Nimitz was. He tended to defer a lot to his boss, Admiral King, on some things. He basically picked and chose his fights with Admiral King, and so he chose that this was probably not one he wanted to start a fight with, and he could see some merits to the operation. General MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific area, was definitely against it. He wanted to take the operations when the discussions were serious about Operation Causeway, was the recapturing the Philippines from the Japanese was already underway, and MacArthur wanted to take Luzon, the island of Luzon, and if Causeway was implemented, Luzon would have been bypassed. Basically, it would have been just like the rest of the island hopping. And MacArthur did not want that. He wanted to fully recapture and follow through with his promise to return to the Philippines, and he didn't want to bypass it. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, was also against it because he believed it was just too many resources to take such a large island. He's also had some questions about operating in the seas around the Formosa. So he favored the taking of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And as we know, those were actually islands that were decided to be taken in World War II. As I said, Formosa had been ruled by the Japanese around since 1895. And though they were not Japanese, they were expected. There was a large Japanese contingent there. There was Japanese civilians there, and there was considered to be a generally friendly local population to the Japanese, and there was concern that they would create a fierce resistance to any invasion. So the U.S. was looking at a hostile invasion of Formosa, just like the Chinese could expect from the Taiwanese. So there's still a lot of parallels going on between the two operations. So it was expected, and this is where Admiral Spruance talked about being resource intensive. It would have taken 500,000 Marines and soldiers were expected to be needed to take and pacify the island. That is greater than D-Day. And so Operation Causeway was going to be a more complex operation than D-Day over a longer distance. Due to weather, there's only 4 good months out of the year that provide favorable weather in the Taiwan Straits for an invasion. The months are March and April, and September and October. So there's not a lot of time periods to take this. Operation Causeway would have landed on the southern tip of Formosa and in the islands of Penghu. These are the same areas that they're expecting that the Chinese will operate. They'll land on the southern tip of Formosa, of Taiwan. They will take most likely Penghu, and there's one other island, and probably the Senkaku Islands, and they will probably attempt a landing in the north, where the U.S. was not talking about landing in the north. So the Chinese are talking about it looks like their indications of their invasion routes is they are actually going to try a more complex operation than what the U.S. was talking about in World War II. So the U.S. was also talking about they expected to be able to take Formosa in 27 days. Now, this was really optimistic. It took 36 days to take Iwo Jima. If you look at Iwo Jima on a map, it's a speck compared to Formosa. And it took 80 days to take Okinawa, which is also much, much smaller than Formosa. So the operation was considered more complex than Operation Overlord, D-Day, and was expected to produce 150,000 casualties. So over 1/4 of the force of the landing force was expected to become casualties, and much more civilians and Japanese were expected to be casualties in the taking of it as well. The terrain is mountainous, and the jungles are ideal for guerrilla warfare. That still holds true today. Friendly native population to Japan after 50 years of Japanese rule. So the U.S. was expecting a hostile population if they land on Formosa. The Chinese can expect a hostile population if they land on there. Reinforcing and supply and landing, especially in bad weather. The weather has not changed. It is still a rough seas area. Technology has improved ships to an extent, but not to the extent that it makes such an operation to be an easy operation. Disease. Well, okay, yeah, there was a lot of disease back then. It would be expected to be the same thing. The other thing, too, is that the way the island of Taiwan is formed is really the best invasion routes are the Chinese-facing side. So you would be more onto the western side of the island than the eastern side of the island. So that's the more favorable place to operate. So the U.S., though, even though it had more of an option to come from the south or come from the east, chose to come from the south because that's where the ideal landing places were going to go. So the U.S. has studied this in depth of the Formosa operations, and a lot of it is still relevant today, as I just discussed. Many of the factors that stopped the U.S. Navy from launching the invasion are still true today. Determined resistance, hostile population, terrain, and basically the same landing that the U.S. was envisioning. Weather. Weather is another factor. So all these factors that said that the U.S. looked into Causeway still exist today. The U.S. was the best at that time, in 1944, was absolutely the best by far of conducting amphibious operations from the logistics piece all the way to the experience of the Marine Corps, the Army units assigned to it, the Navy. The U.S. was very, very good at this, was the best in the world by far of being able to conduct large-scale amphibious operations. both in Europe, Africa, Italy. Oh, no, that's part of Europe, all through the Pacific. The U.S. was by far the best. And they deemed it, the U.S. Navy deemed it, too complex and too risky. China, on the other hand, has no experience in modern warfare and no battlefield experience. Their last war, so they have no troops in their army that have experience, battlefield experience. The last war that China fought was in 1979 against Vietnam, and it did not go well for China. So, even with the advantages of modern warfare, there are factors that exist today as they did in 1944. Terrain, population, weather, hostile population and weather. The conducting of the operations that the Chinese are talking about is what's called a forcible entry operation. Just like it would have been in 1944, it will be the same in 2024. It will take a lot of personnel to accomplish seizing and occupying Taiwan. The U.S. only had to worry about Japan in a Formosa invasion. There was no the Japanese fleet was, by that time, was not a formidable force. Most of it had been destroyed around the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The U.S. no longer had to worry. If it invaded Formosa, it did not have to worry about any other force coming from the outside to try to stop them. China, on the other hand, has to worry about the Taiwan and its resistance, the U.S., most likely the U.S., Japan, Austria, and possibly the Philippines, New Zealand, UK, and France being involved in the operation. That means that China cannot limit itself to the Taiwan Straits, but will have to operate its navy in the eastern side of Taiwan, and that would probably have to be, and they would probably have to invade the Senkaku Islands from Japan to cover that northern approach. So they actually have to do more than what the U.S. was talking about in Causeway. The Chinese are talking about landing in the north and the south, possibly in the middle, plus taking, is it Pengchu Island, Senkaku Islands, and I think there's one other sets of islands, extend their fleet around the, blockade the island of Taiwan, and then most likely have to face a counterattack from U.S., Japan, and Australia, and possibly the Philippines. So that's a lot of risk for an unproven military. And so the most formidable military in the world at conducting amphibious operations at its height of power said, no, this is too complex and risky. An unproven China is going to be able to do that in a more complex operation. Seems like, this is actually, at this point, when you start looking at it, this seems to push the boundaries of unbelievability. And then it's kind of talked about a little bit about if the war actually does occur. So if Taiwan, it says that all this happens and Taiwan appears that they're going to lose, what will Taiwan do? Will it attack? And this is not any genius that's been talked about, is will Taiwan attack the Three Gorges Dam? If they destroy the biggest dam in the world, if they destroy the Three Gorges Dam, this will threaten 1/3 of the Chinese population that lives downstream of the Three Gorges Dam, and will Taiwan destroy its technology infrastructure? So it would could leave China devastated by the loss of the Three Gorges Dam. Of course, China knows it, so they probably have defenses up as well. But so it's not like it's a foregone conclusion that they could destroy the Three Gorges Dam, but there's a huge risk to 1/3 of a population of over 1 billion people. 1/3 is threatened by an attack on the Three Gorges Dam. So at the risks of a Taiwan invasion are so significant, again, talking about the complexity of the operations, all the things the U.S. looked at and said, no, this is too much to do. And then on top of that, the threat of the attack on the Three Gorges Dam and then losing all that technology infrastructure that the Taiwanese decided to destroy. Is the risk of a Taiwan invasion so significant? Would China really want to risk it? A win would be expected to create high casualties. So even in winning it, it could be a consequential impact on the Chinese populace and create social unrest. Let's say it kills, I'll just throw a number out, kills 100,000 Chinese in a country that hasn't fought a significant war since the Korean War. So how is the social fabric of China going to deal with that? There might be a nationalist uprising where, like, a sense of patriotism. But if the war continues to go badly and the economy has all the headwinds, like we talked about earlier with the decoupling of China, and then at war with the U.S. and Japan, a lot of high casualties, what are they going to think about this? And this is not to say about the high cost of occupation of the taking the island, and then the cost of rebuilding. The Chinese people would have to pay for that. Are they willing to pay that? Is this something that, or was this going to even cause even more unrest? And you can forget about the idea of an economy that's based on trade. If you go to war with the U.S. and the European, most likely the European Union, I don't know if they would go to war, but they would certainly boycott China. So China's going to have to rebuild Taiwan after destroying it. They're going to have to occupy it. And they will have lost their primary source of trading. Now, China is not extremely rich in natural resources. They do have a lot of rare earth metals, but they only have a lot of rare earth metals is because they sell them at a cheaper price than the West can produce. So they've shut down their mines. The West can open those mines right back up. So what does China do if it loses its export economy at the cost of taking Taiwan? So a loss would be even more detrimental if they lost. They tried to take Taiwan and they lost. That would be even more detrimental. And you can guarantee that Xi Jinping, who's trying to get those accolades that Mao Zedong wasn't ever able to get, he will lose those accolades. He will probably be ejected from the Communist Party, and along with all his factions, all his supporters will all be gone. They will be blamed for the war and loss. So there's a lot of high risk for China to do this. So with all these factors, that there's a non-inconsequential risk that the CCP leadership is aware that an invasion is a realistic option. So knowing all these risks, and they know that all this is this really their first option? Excuse me. Is the current Chinese attitude just a form of gray zone operations to wear down the Taiwanese leadership to concede some of its sovereignty? Or is it to put much more pressure on it so it won't declare independence and risk the Chinese ire? So is this just a way of maintaining the status quo as the Taiwanese become more nationalistic and electing leaders that are a little bit more wary of China, less friendly to China? Is some of this a reaction to that? And is this the way that China is attempting to reset expectations of the Taiwanese people? Probably not, but I know they have to be aware of the great risks of an unproven military to conduct such a complex operation and expect them to succeed the first time out, and to do so against the most powerful military in the world. It's a tall order, and these are not dumb people that are running China, so they have to know this. So how much of this is bluff and how much of this is fatalistic visions of a maniacal leader? So my final question, I guess, is there an internal factor that's driving the Chinese to want to invade the island as the first option? So is it a maniacal leader, Xi Jinping, wanting to make a name for himself, something that will carry on for all time? Everybody will remember Xi Jinping as the great conqueror of Taiwan. Is there a demographic or economic time bomb that makes this a now or never operation that cannot wait? So those are just factors that it seems like, is this really the best option? It doesn't seem like the best option for China. Is this the first option, or is there just something else that's doing this? And if there's something else that's driving the leadership to threaten a Taiwan invasion, it might be worthwhile for the West to know about it. So those were the 3 papers this week. So it was did not exactly set the world on fire with these papers throughout this week, but that's okay. I want to thank everybody for all the participation you had last week, because last week was my, I didn't think we'd get there, but it was my best single week on Substack, which beat the prior week, which would beat the prior week. So I had a 3 weeks in a row of the best numbers that I've had before on Substack. So doesn't look like it's going to happen this week, but that's okay. I just want to thank everybody for everything they did. I still don't have a lot of subscribers on Substack. It would help if people subscribed, because that would help when people look at you to see if you're an authoritative source, and they only see 17 people as subscribers. It doesn't really play well. So it would be a great help if you could support me. There's no payment required. You will get a lot of great content by becoming a member. But even if you don't become a member, I do appreciate all that, taking the time to listen to me in this podcast and taking time to read my articles. I looked through here, and I did add 2 new countries that have listened to my podcast, so that's always kind of fun. So I have 33 countries listening to me. So this goes in order of countries that listen. United States first. Okay, that makes sense. Belgium second. Kind of threw me for a loop. Canada, Germany, Australia, Kenya, Ireland, Greece, India, United Kingdom, Hong Kong. I'm sure they're loving my Chinese content in Hong Kong. So for all those people in Hong Kong, hang in there. Netherlands, Poland, Russia, Sweden, Singapore, Brazil, France. Oh, they're going to love the one about Macron. Honduras, Hungary, Japan, Luxembourg, North Macedonia, Mongolia, Mexico, Nigeria, the Philippines. Hey, I want to shout out the Philippines. They have been big supporters of my videos on YouTube, so always have an appreciation for the people of the Philippines. I always said that looking at the history of the Philippines, is there's no better friend you would have and no worse enemy you'd want than the Philippine people. So I have a lot of respect for the Philippines and standing up to what they've done against the Chinese unreasonableness in the South China Sea. Paraguay, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Uruguay, Vietnam, and South Africa. Vietnam and South Africa were new additions this week. So I want to say hi to everybody to take the time to listen. That's always kind of fun. I'm kind of a stats person. I think I've crossed about 30,000 views on YouTube, which far exceeds what I have on Substack. But I will let everybody know, Substack is still my primary means for communication, even though I get wider followings out of YouTube, Rumble. There is nothing in either of those channels that are not provided on Substack. Substack has done a really good job by allowing you to play videos, podcasting, on top of writing papers. So Substack has done a very good job of providing outlets for my endeavors here. So I will continue to all my work will go through Substack. There will be, again, at this point, I don't see any point in doing it, is there will be no exclusivities planned for YouTube or Rumble at this time. I'd say at this time because if Rumble offers me $1 million for exclusive content, yeah, I think I'll take that deal, but I don't see that happening. So anyway, if you are not a member, please consider subscribing. That would help me out a lot. If you're listening to me on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple, please leave a comment and thumbs up. I will, as I start getting more comments, hopefully as I get more popular, I start getting some more comments, maybe we'll do a section on these weekly podcasts, or maybe I'll do a second podcast where we'll talk about the comments. Again, when you can write something and you get both the Russians and the Ukrainians mad at you, or they start arguing with each other, that's actually kind of fun. I see that on X quite a bit with my postings. So anyway, that is the show for today. Hopefully I'll listen to this back and see if there's anything like maybe the mic is too hot, or if I need to make adjustments with this new audio system that I have. We will see. But anyway, I hope all of you have a great week. Remember, in the U.S. is Mother's Day tomorrow. Go wish your moms a happy Mother's Day, and I hope all of you have a great weekend. And please join me on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or however you take my content throughout the week. Hope to hear from you, and I will talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.